Hello, dear ones. Good to see you. A pleasure, as always, to spend time with you. I have a plan for tonight, which is that I'm not going to talk very long at the beginning, in part because I don't have a huge amount to say, because life is just life at the moment, but also because I want to finish the book tonight, since it's the second of two, and otherwise we'd have a tiny little segment, a little rump end of the book left, and an entire weekend and two readings to figure out how to distribute those. So what I am planning to do is to start in the next few minutes and just read until I finish and then quit. Ooh, I got a blur there. Read until I finish and then quit. Since I don't know how long it'll be. I don't think it'll go past the top of the hour. I have no idea, though. It's really hard to judge written material. And so that's the basic plan. I will check in and see who's around very quickly. And then, as I said, I'm going to, nothing really to relate here, nothing to report. So I'm not skipping over anything important to keep keep it from you. We're all alive. We're all healthy. Things are going on as they go on, and life is going on as it goes on. So because I'm going to be finishing up the book, I'm going to not be reading next week. And how long I won't be reading for, I'm not exactly sure. It won't be too long because I enjoy this and people seem to enjoy it. So I will come back to do something there, within a couple of weeks. But I just wanted to mention that's the plan anyway. So with that said, I hope this is going to go back where it wants to go and needs to go. Okay, good. So let me see who's checked in so far, and I will quickly say hello to all of them. And let me see. So what do we got here? Comments. Who's made comments? That's all I can tell you, really, is who's made comments, because I can't access them all. It's so weird. Anyway, so I see Ron is here. And hi, Ron. And James. Hello, hello. Good to see you, James. Tim, a pleasure. Jeremy, hello. Emily, good to see you too. Angie, hi. Kristen, and who else? Barban, and Becca, come back. Becca, and Jim Key, hello, Jim, and Melissa, good to see you, and Claudia, and Kelly, and Medardo, and Mike Schaefer, hi, Mike, and Tiffany, and Christy, and that's Christy Sanders, not Kristen. We've got one of each. And Susan. So hello, Susan. Good to see you too, and good to see you all. And with that, as I said, I'm trying to think. There's not really much else to tell. I'm not cheating you out of any information. I don't really have any. The only thing that's of any significance is that I basically will be finishing my polish of the first draft in the next probably 24 hours, depending on when I get a chance to work. And at that point, it will go off and it'll be out of my hands for a little while all of my first readers finish it up. And then I will start the official rewrite, as opposed to this particular kind of rewrite I've been doing, which is more of just sort of getting rid of the obvious problems, but not wanting to put in too much work before people have a chance to say things like, well, this whole bit was just awful, or yeah, you should probably start right after the first chapter and then just get rid of everything and start over, or whatever people may have to say about the books. So that's basically where I am. Dogs are fine. Cat is fine. You can see the cat sleeping. Whoops, wrong side. Cat sleeping behind me there. Deb is well. Young people are well. Nothing really much to tell, as I said. So with that being the case, I am going to start reading early tonight. And yeah, that's pretty much what's going on. So just so you know. As I recall, we had just finished chapter 42, which ended on Simon facing off against the ice dragon, Igjarjuk, and running toward it with Thorn, which he had found he could lift when two strong soldiers could not, and running toward the dragon to try to save Jiriki, and getting a gout of black blood splashed on him, and then he fell down, and that's the last he knew. So this brings us to chapter 43, The Harrowing. The robin orange breast glinting like a fading ember, lighted on one of the elm's low branches. He turned his head slowly from side to side, surveying the herb garden, and chirped impatiently, as if displeased to find everything in such poor order. Josua watched him fly away, dipping over the garden wall, then arching sharply upward to speed past the battlements of the inner keep. Within a moment, he was a speck of black against the bright dawn. Within a moment, he was a speck of black against the bright gray dawn. "The first robin I have seen in a very long time. Perhaps it is a hopeful sign in this dark even." The prince turned, surprised, to see Yarnauga standing on the path, eyes fixed on the spot where the bird had disappeared. The old man, apparently unmindful of the cold, wore only breeches and a thin shirt. His white feet were bare. "Good morning, Yarnauga," Josua said, pulling the neck of his cloak a little tighter, as if the Rimmersman's unsusceptibility increased his own chill. "What brings you out to the garden so early?" "This old body needs very little sleep, Prince Josua," he smiled, "and I might ask you the same in turn, but I think I know the answer." Josua nodded morosely. "I have not slept well since I first entered my brother's dungeons. While my comfort has improved since then, worry has taken the place of hanging in chains as a denier of rest." "There are many kinds of imprisonment," Yarnauga nodded. They walked quietly for a while through the maze of walkways. The garden was the Lady Vorsheva's one-time pride, set out to her meticulous guidelines. For a girl born in a wagon, the prince's courtiers whispered, she was certainly a stickler for elegance. But it had now been allowed to deteriorate due to poor weather, as well as an abundance of more pressing concerns. "Something is amiss, Yarnauga," Josua said at last. "I can sense it. I can almost feel it, as a fisherman feels the weather. What is my brother doing?" "It seems to me he is doing his best to kill us all," the old man replied, a tight grin creasing his leathery face. "Is that what is amiss?" "No," the prince said seriously. "No, that is just the problem. We have held him off for a month, with bitter losses. Baron Ordmeyer, Sir Grimstead, Vulderkeen of Caldsay, as well as hundreds of stout yeomen. But it has been nearly a fortnight since he has mounted a serious assault. The attacks have been cursory. He is going through the motions of a siege. Why?" He sat down on a low bench, and Yarnauga sat beside him. "Why?" he repeated. "A siege is not always won by force of arms. Perhaps he is planning to starve us out. But then why bother to attack us at all? We have inflicted terrible losses on them. Why not just wait? It is as though he seeks only to keep us inside and himself outside. What is Elias doing?" The old man shrugged. "As I have told you, I can see much, but the insides of men's hearts are beyond my vision. If you have survived so far, let us be thankful. I am. But I know my brother. He is not the type to sit patiently and wait. There is something in the wind, some plan." He trailed off into silence and sat staring at an overgrown bed of mockfoil. The flowers had never opened, and weeds stood insolently among the twining stems, like carrion eaters mingling with a dying herd. "He could have been a magnificent king, you know," Josua said suddenly, as if in answer to some unspoken question. "There was a time when he was just strong, not a bully. That is to say, he was sometimes cruel when we were younger, but it was only that innocent sort of cruelty that big boys show to the smaller ones. He even taught me some things. Swordplay, wrestling. I never taught him anything. He was not very interested in the things I knew about." The prince smiled sadly, and for a moment a child's fragile look seemed to shine through his close pared features. "We might even have been friends." The prince knitted his long fingers and blew warm breath into them. "If only Hylissa had lived." "Miriamel's mother?" Yarnauga asked quietly. "She was very beautiful. Southern, you know, black hair, white teeth. She was very shy, but when she smiled, it was as though a lamp had been lit. And she loved my brother as best she could. But he frightened her. So loud, so big, and she was very small. Slim like a willow, jumped if one only touched her shoulder." The prince said no more, but sat lost in thought. Watery sunshine broke through the clouds on the horizon, bringing a little color to the drab garden. "You sound as though you thought much of her," the old man said gently. "Oh, I loved her." Joshua's voice was matter-of-fact, his eyes still firmly fixed on the tangled mock-foil. "I burned for love of her. I prayed to God to take the love away, even though I knew that I would be but a husk, the living core of me scooped out. Not that my prayer did any good. And I think she loved me, too. I was her only friend, she often said. No one else knew her as I did." "Did Elias suspect?" "Of course. He suspected anyone who as much as stood near her at court pageants, and I was with her constantly. But always honorably," he added hurriedly, then stopped. "Why should I be so earnest about that, even now? You Sires, forgive me, I wish we had betrayed him." Joshua's teeth were clenched. "I wish she were my dead lover instead of only my brother's dead wife." He stared accusingly at the knob of scarred flesh protruding from his right sleeve. "Her death lies on my conscience like a great stone. It was my fault. My God, we are a haunted family." He broke off at the clatter of footsteps on the path. "Prince Joshua! Prince Joshua, where are you?" "Here," the prince called distractedly, and a moment later one of his guards stumbled into view around a hedge wall. "My prince," he gasped, bending a knee. "Sir Daenoth says you must come at once." "Are they onto the walls again?" Joshua asked, standing and shaking dew from his wool cloak. His voice still sounded distant. "No, sire," the guard said, his mustached mouth opening and closing in excitement as though he were a whiskered fish. "It's your brother. I mean the king, sire. He's pulling back. The siege is ending." The prince gave Yarnauga a puzzled, worried glance as they hurried up the path behind the excited guard. "The High King has given over," Daenoth shouted as Joshua made his way up the steps, cloak billowing in the wind. "See! He turns tail and runs." Daenoth turned and gave Izorn a comradely smack on the shoulder. The duke's son grinned, but Einskaldir, beside him, glared fiercely at the young Erkenlander, lest he should think to try anything so foolish on him. "What now? What?" Joshua said, pushing up beside Daenoth on the sagging curtain wall. Directly below them lay the shattered ruins of a miner's box, evidence of a futile attempt to drop the curtain wall by tunneling beneath it. The wall had dipped a few feet, but held. Dendinis had built for the ages. The miners, even as they had set fire to the wooden pillars shoring their tunnels, had been felled by the few stones they had themselves shaken loose. In the distance lay Elias's camp, an ant hill of scurrying activity. The remaining siege engines had been toppled and shattered so that they would benefit no one else. The rows and rows of tents had vanished, as if swept up and carried away by gale winds. Thin sounds, the distant cry of drovers, the crack of whips, floated up as the High King's wagons were loaded. "He is retreating," Daenoth said happily. "We have done it." Joshua shook his head. "Why?" Why should he? We have whittled away a bare fraction of his troops. Perhaps he realizes now how strong Naglumund is, Izorn said, squinting. Then why not wait us out? The prince demanded. Adon, what goes on here? I can believe Elias himself might go back to the Hayhold. But why not leave even a token siege in place? To lure us out, Einskaldir said quietly, onto open ground. Scowling, he rubbed a rough thumb over the blade of his knife. It could be, the prince said, but he should know me better. Jazwa? Yarnauga was looking out beyond the decamping army into the morning haze cloaking the northern horizon. There are strange clouds away to the north. The others stared, but could see nothing but the dim beginnings of the frost march. What sort of clouds? The prince asked at last. Storm clouds. Very strange. Like none I have ever seen south of the mountains. Next section. The prince stood at the window, listening to the murmur of the trailing wind, his forehead pressed against the cold stone frame. The spare courtyard below was moon-painted, and the trees swayed. Vorsheva extended a white arm from beneath the fur coverlet. Jazwa, what is it? It is cold. Shut the window and come back to your bed. He did not turn. The wind goes everywhere, he said quietly. There is no keeping it out, and there is no staying it when it wishes to depart. It is too late at night for your riddles, Joshua, she said, yawning and running fingers through her inky hair so that it spread upon the sheet like black wings. It is perhaps too late for many things, he replied, and went to sit on the bed beside her. His hand gently stroked her long neck, but still he looked out toward the window. I am sorry, Vorsheva. I am confusing, I know. I have never been the right man, not for my tutors, not for my brother or my father, and not for you. I sometimes wonder if I was born out of my time. He lifted his finger to trace her cheek, and her warm breath was on his hand. When I see the world as it has been presented to me, I feel only a deep loneliness. Lonely! Vorsheva sat up. The fur robe fell away. Her smooth ivory skin was banded in moonlight. By my clan, Joshua, you are a cruel man. Still you punish me for my mistake in trying to help the princess. How can you share my bed and call yourself lonely? Go away, you moping boy. Go sleep with one of those cold northern girls or in some monk's den. Go then. She struck at him, and he caught her arm. She was strong, despite her slenderness, and she slapped him twice with her other hand before he could roll atop her and pinion her. Peace, lady, peace, he said, and then laughed, although his face stung. Vorsheva scowled and struggled. You are right, he said. I have done you insult, and I ask your apology. I sue for peace. He leaned down and kissed her on the neck, and then again on her anger-reddened cheek. Come nearer, and I will bite you, she hissed. Her body trembled against his. I was frightened for you when you went to battle, Joshua. I thought you would die. I was no less frightened, my lady. There is much in the world to fear. And now you feel you are alone. One can be lonely, the prince said, offering his lip to be bitten, in the highest and best of company. Her arm, now free, closed around his neck to pull him closer. The moonlight silvered their intertwined limbs. Next section. Joshua dropped his bone spoon back into the soup bowl and angrily watched the small eddies wash back and forth across the surface. The dining hall hummed with the rush of many voices. I cannot eat. I must know. Forsheva, eating in silence but with her usual good appetite, shot him a disquieted glance down the table. Whatever is happening, my prince, Darnoth said shyly, you must have your strength. You will need it to speak to your people, Prince Josua, Izorn commented around a mouthful of bread. They are upset and puzzled. The king is gone. Why no celebration? You know damnably well why not, Josua snapped, then raised his hand to his temple in pain. Surely you can see this is some trap, that Elias would not give up so easily. I suppose, said Izorn, but did not seem convinced. That does not mean the people who have been crowded in the inner keep like cattle. He gestured with a large hand at the milling folks pressed around the prince's table on all sides, most sitting on the floor or against the walls of the dining hall, chairs too precious for any but the noblest. That they will understand. Take it from one who spent a hellish winter snowbound in Elvritsala. Izorn bit off another great hunk of bread. Josua sighed and turned to Yarnauga. The old man, his serpent tattoos strangely mobile in the lantern light, was deep in conversation with Father Strangyard. Yarnauga, the prince said quietly, you said you wished to talk to me of a dream you had. The old Rimmersgarder excused himself from the priest. Yes, Josua, he answered, leaning close, but perhaps we should wait until we might speak privately. He cocked an ear to the clamor of the dining hall. Then again, no one could eavesdrop in here even if he sat under your chair. He showed a frosty smile. I have had dreams again, he said at last, eyes jewel-bright beneath his brows. I have no power to summon them, but they sometimes come unbidden. Something has happened to the company, sent to Ermsheim. Something? Josua's face was shadowed, slack. I only dreamed, Yarnauga said defensively, but I felt a great rupture, pain and terror, and I felt the boy Simon calling out in fear and anger and something else. Could what has happened to them be the cause of the storm you saw this morning? The prince asked leadenly, as if hearing bad news long expected. I do not think so. Ermsheim is in the range farther east, behind Rossel Lake and across the wastes. Are they alive? I have no way of knowing. It was a dream, and a short, strange one at that. They walked later in silence on the high castle walls. The wind had rolled the clouds away, and the moon turned the deserted town below to bone and parchment. Staring out into the black northern sky, Josua exhaled steamily. So even the faint hope of Thorn is gone. I did not say so. You had no need. And I suppose you and Strangyard are no nearer to discovering what has become of Fingal's sword, Miniyar. Sadly, no. Then what more needs to be done to assure our downfall? God has played a cruel joke on... Josua broke off as the old man clenched his arm. Prince Josua, he said, gazing squint-eyed at the horizon, you convince me never to taunt the gods, even those who are not your own. He sounded shaken, old for the first time. What do you mean? You asked what more could be done to us. The old man snorted in bitter humor. The storm clouds, that black storm in the north. It is moving toward us, and very swiftly, too. Next section. Young Austriel of Runechester stood shivering on the curtain wall and reflected on what his father had once said.
'Tis good to serve thy prince. Thou see a bit of the world as soldier boy.
First Fram had told him, folding his leathery farmer's hand over his son's shoulder, even as his mother, red-eyed, silently watched.
Maybe and they'll get to Southern Islands, or down the Banway, and get to sell out this be damn frost march wind.
His father was gone now. He'd disappeared last winter, dragged off by wolves during that terrible cold Decander. Wolves or something else, for no trace of him was ever found. And First Fram's son, the southern life still untasted, stood on a wall in the freezing wind and felt the cold penetrating his very heart. Austrael's mother and sisters huddled below with hundreds of the other dispossessed in makeshift barracks inside Nagleman's heavy stone keep. The walls of the keep provided far better shelter from the wind than did Austrael's high perch, but even stone walls, no matter how thick, could not keep out the dreadful music of the approaching storm. His eyes were drawn, fearfully but irresistibly, up to the dark blot roiling on the horizon, spreading as it came like gray ink poured into water. It was a smear, a blank space, as if something had rubbed away the stuff of reality. It was a spot where the very sky seemed to tilt, funneling the clouds downward into a slow, swirling mass like the tail of a whirlpool. From time to time, bright prickles of lightning leaped across the top of the storm, and always, there was the horrible sound of drumming, distant as a spatter of rain on a thick roof, insistent as the chattering of Austrael's teeth. The hot air and fabled sun-dotted hills of Naban seemed more and more to First Fram's son like the book stories told by priests, a bit of imaginary comfort to drag one along, to hide the terror of inescapable death. The storm came on, throbbing with drums like a hive of wasps. Daernoth's lantern guttered in the stiff wind and nearly flickered out. He shielded it with his cloak until the flame grew steady once more. Beside him, Izorn, his Grimnerson, stared out into the cold, lightning-scratched darkness.
God's tree! It's black as night, Daernoth groaned. Just past noon, yet I can scarcely see it all.
Izorn's mouth opened, a dark slash in his pale, lantern-lit face, but no sound came out. His jaw worked.
All will be well, Daernoth said, frightened himself by the strong young Rimmersman's fear. 'Tis just a storm, some evil petty trick of Pryrates. Even as he said it, he felt sure it was a lie. The black clouds that masked the sun, dragging night to the very gates of Nagleman, brought with them a dread that pressed on his very being like a weight, like the stone lid of a casket. What magician's summoning was this? What mere wizardry that could push an icy spear of horror right into his very guts? The storm trudged toward them, a clot of darkness spreading far beyond the castle walls on either side, looming above the highest battlements, shot through with the blue-white flicker of lightning. The huddled town and countryside leaped into relief for a moment, then vanished again in the murk. The throbbing of drum beats echoed against the curtain wall. As the lightning flashed once more, momentarily counterfeiting the stolen daylight, Daernoth saw something that caused him to turn and grasp Izorn's broad arm so tightly that the Rimmersman winced. Get the prince.
Daernoth's voice was hollow. Izorn looked up, his superstitious fear of the storm overcome by the strangeness of Daernoth's manner. The young knight's face had gone slack, empty like a meal bag, even as his fingernails drew an unnoticed rill of blood from Izorn's arm.
What is it? Get Prince Josua, Daernoth repeated. Go!
The Rimmersman, with a backward glance at his friend, made the sign of the tree and staggered along the battlement toward the stairs. Numb, heavy as lead, Daernoth stood and wished that he had been killed at Bullback Hill, even that he had died in disgrace, rather than see what was before him.
When Izorn returned with the prince and Yarnauga, Daernoth was still staring. There was no need to ask what he saw, for the lightning illuminated all. A great army had come to Naglimund. Within the storm's swirling mist stood a vast forest of bristling spears. A galaxy of bright eyes gleamed in the darkness. The drums rolled again like thunder, and the storm settled over castle and town, a great billowing tent of rain and black clouds and freezing fog. The eyes gazed up at the walls, thousands of shining eyes, all full of fierce anticipation. White hair streamed in the wind. Narrow white faces turned upward in their dark helms, staring at the walls of Naglimund. Spear tips glinted blue in another flash of skyfire. The invaders peered silently upward like an army of ghosts, pale as blindfish, ethereal as moonsheen. The drums pulsed. In the mist, other longer shadows stalked, giant shapes, cloaked in armor, carrying great gnarled clubs. The drums pulsed again, then fell silent. "Merciful Adon, give me rest," Izorn prayed. "In your arms will I sleep, upon thy bosom will—" "Who are they, Josua?" Daernoth asked quietly, as if merely curious. "The white foxes, the Norns," the prince answered. "They are Elias's reinforcements." He lifted his hand wearily, as if to block the spectral legion from his sight. "They are the Storm King's children." "Your Eminence, please." Father Strangyard tugged at the old man's arm, gently at first, then with increasing force. The old man clung to the bench like a whelk, a small shape in the darkness of the herb garden. "We must pray, Strangyard," Bishop Anodis repeated stubbornly. "Get you down on your knees." The throbbing, percussive sound of the storm intensified. The archive master felt a panicky urge to run, somewhere, anywhere. It is no natural twilight, Bishop. You must come inside now, please." "I knew I should not have stayed. I told Prince Josua not to resist the rightful king," Anodis added plaintively. "God is angry with us. We must pray to be shown the rightful path. We must remember his martyrdom on the tree." He waved his hand convulsively as though swatting at flies. This is not God's doing," Strangyard replied, a scowl on his usually pleasant face. "This is the work of your rightful king, he and his pet warlock." The bishop paid him no heed. "Blessed Osiris," he babbled, crawling away from the priest toward the shadowy tangle of the mockfoil bed. "Your humble supplicants repent of their sins. We have thwarted your will, and in doing so have drawn your just wrath." "Bishop Anodis!" cried Strangyard in nervous exasperation, taking a step to follow him, then halting in surprise. A dense, swirling cloud seemed to descend over the garden. A moment later, as the archive master shuddered in the deepening chill, the sound of drumming stopped. "Something?" A frosty wind flapped Strangyard's hood in his face. "Oh, yea, we have sinned mightily in our haughtiness, we puny men," Anodis sang out, rattling through the mockfoil. "We pray! We pray!" He trailed off, his voice rising curiously. "Bishop?" There was a shudder of movement in the depth of the mockfoil. Strangyard saw the old man's face appear, mouth agape. Something seemed to catch at him. Dirt began to gout up all around, further obscuring events in the shadowy vegetation. The bishop screamed, a thin, keening sound. "Anodis!" Strangyard shouted, plunging into the mockfoil. "Bishop!" The screaming stopped. Strangyard halted a moment later, standing over the bishop's huddled form. Slowly, as if the old man were revealing the end of some elaborate trick, the bishop rolled to one side. Part of his face was a wash of red blood. A black head sat on the ground beside him, like a doll thrown aside by a forgetful child. The head, chewing rapidly, turned, grinning toward Strangyard. Its tiny eyes were white as bleached currants, the scraggly whiskers shiny with the bishop's blood. As it reached a long-fingered hand out of the hole to pull the bishop closer, two more heads popped from the ground on either side. The archive master took a step backward. A scream lodged in his throat like a stone. The ground convulsed again, here, there, on all sides. Thin black hands, wriggling like mole snouts, pushed up through the soil. Strangyard stumbled backward and fell, dragging himself toward the path, certain that at any moment a small, clammy hand would close on his ankle. His mouth was stretched wide in a rictus of fear, but no sound came. He had lost his sandals in the undergrowth, and he lurched up the path toward the chapel on noiseless bare feet. The world seemed damply blanketed in silence. It choked him and squeezed at his heart. Even the crash of the chapel door behind him seemed muffled. As he fumbled the bolt home, a curtain of featureless gray came down before his eyes, and he fell into it gratefully, like a soft bed. The flames of countless torches now rose among the Norns like blossoms in a poppy field, throwing the horridly beautiful faces into scarlet half-silhouette, adding grotesquely to the stature of the Let me start that one again. The flames of countless torches now rose among the Norns like blossoms in a poppy field, throwing the horridly beautiful faces into scarlet half-silhouette, adding grotesquely to the stature of the battle-garbed Hunin lurking behind. Soldiers clambered up onto the Nagleman castle walls, only to stare down in shocked silence. 5 ghostly figures, on horses pale as spider silk, rode out into the open space before the curtain wall. The torchlight played on their hooded white cloaks, and the red pyramid of Stormspike glimmered and pulsed on their long rectangular shields. Fear seemed to surround these hooded ones like a cloud, reaching out into the hearts of all who saw them. The watchers on the walls felt a terrible, helpless weakness fall upon them. The lead horseman lifted his spear. The 4 behind him did the same. The drum sounded 3 times. "Where is the master of Ujin Edasikonai, the snare that traps the hunter?" The first horseman's voice was a mocking, echoing moan, like wind blowing down a long canyon. "Where is the master of the House of 1,000 Nails?" The hovering storm breathed for long moments before the reply came. "I am here." Josua stepped forward, a slender shadow atop the gatehouse. "What does such a strange band of travelers want at my door?" His voice was calm, but there was in it a faint quaver. "Why, we have come to see how the nails have rusted, while we have grown strong." The words came slowly, forced out in a hiss of air, as if the horseman was unused to speech. "We have come, mortal, to have a little of our own back. This time it is man blood that will spill on the soil of Ostenard. We have come to pull your house down about your ears." The implacable power and hatred of the hollow voice was such that many of the soldiers cried out and began to scramble down the walls back into the castle below. As Josua stood on the gate, unspeaking, a cry shrilled above the groans and frightened whispers of the Naglemunders. "Diggers! There are diggers within the walls!" The prince turned at a movement close by. It was Daernoth climbing up on unsteady legs to stand at his side. "The gardens of the keep are full of bookin," the young knight said. His eyes were wide as he looked down on the white horseman. The prince took a step forward. "You speak as though of revenge," he shouted to the pale multitude below. "But that is a lie. You come at the bidding of the High King Elias, a mortal. You serve a mortal, as a tick-bird does a cock-and-drill. Come then, do your worst. You will find that not all the nails of Naglamund are rusted, and that there is iron here that can still deal death to the Scythy." A ragged cheer went up from those soldiers still atop the walls. The first rider spurred his horse forward a pace. "We are the Red Hand." His voice was as cold as the grave. "We serve no one but Ineluki, the Lord of Storms. Our reasons are our own, as your death will be your own." He waved his spear above his head, and the drums burst out again. Shrill horns wailed. "Bring up those wagons!" Joshua shouted from the gatehouse roof. "Block the way! They will try and throw down the gate." But instead of bringing up a ram to try and shatter the heavy steel and stout timbers of the gate, the Norns stood silent, watching as the 5 horsemen rode unhurriedly forward. One of the guards atop the wall loosed an arrow. It was followed by a score of others, but if they struck the riders, it was only to pass through them. The pale horseman faltered not a step. The drums beat furiously. The pipes and strange trumpets groaned and shrieked. Dismounting, the riders appeared and disappeared in flashes of lightning as they strode the last few steps to the gate. With dreadful deliberateness, the leader reached up to pull open his hooded cloak. A scarlet light seemed to spill forth. As he tore it away, it was as though he turned inside out. Suddenly, he was all formlessness and smoldering red glare. The others did the same. 5 beings of shifting, flickering lines grew and stood revealed, larger than before, each tall as 2 men, faceless, billowing like burning vermilion silk. A black mouth opened in the leader's eyeless face as he lifted his arms to the gate and placed his burning hands against it. "Death!" he bellowed, and his voice seemed to shake the very fundament of the walls. The iron hinges began to glow a dull orange. "Hey Makajosa!" The massive spars blackened and smoked. Joshua, tugging frantically at the dumbstruck Daernoth's arm, leaped down to the top of the wall. "Sian pra Ineluki!" As the prince's soldiers dove shrieking down the staircases, there was a burst of light, a deafening crack louder than drums or thunder, and the mighty gate burst into steaming, sparkling flinders. The shards hissed down in a deadly rain as the wall collapsed on either side, crushing men beneath it, even as they tried to flee. Armored Norns leaped into the smoking gap in the walls. Some lifted long tubes of wood or bone, touching them at the end with flaming brands. Horrible gouts of fire leaped out of the pipes, turning fleeing soldiers into jigging, wailing torches. Great dark shapes pushed through the rubble, the Hunan, swinging long, iron-studded clubs in their shaggy hands, howling like maddened bears as they crushed all in their path. Shattered bodies flew before them like ninepins. Some of the soldiers, courageously resisting the choking fear, turned to fight. A giant went down with 2 spears in its guts, but a moment later the spearmen were dead, feathered with white-fletched Norn arrows. The pallid Norns were pushing through the fuming breach in the wall like maggots, shouting as they came. Daernoth pulled a stumbling Joshua toward the inner keep. The prince's soot-blackened face was wet with tears and blood. "Elias has sown the dragon's teeth," Joshua choked as Daernoth pulled him past a gurgling soldier. Dearnoth thought he recognized the young pikeman, Austriel, who had stood sentry at the king's parley, buried beneath the squirming black bodies of a score of diggers. "My brother has planted seeds for the death of all men," Josua railed. "He is mad." Before Dearnoth could reply, and what reply he briefly wondered could he possibly make, two Norn soldiers, eyes fire gleaming within the slits of their helmets, rounded the corner of the inner keep, dragging a shrieking girl. Spotting Dearnoth, one hissed something, then reached down with his dark, slender sword and dragged the blade across the girl's throat. She dropped, twitching, to the earth behind them. Dearnoth felt the bile rise in his throat as he threw himself forward, sword upraised. The prince was there even before him, Nidel flickering like the lightning that etched the black sky. Afternoon! It was only afternoon. "This is the hour at last, then," Dearnoth thought wildly. Steel rang on polished witchwood. "There must be honor." The thought was desperate. "Even if there's no one to see it, God will see." The white faces, hateful and hating, swam before his sweat-stinging eyes. No dream of hell, no woodcut in any of his many books, no warning of any of his Aedenite teachers could prepare Father Strangyard for the howling inferno Naglemund had become. Lightning sizzled across the sky. Thunder roared, and the voices of slayers and victims alike rose to the heavens like the babble of the damned. Despite the wind and driving rains, fires were leaping up everywhere in the darkness, killing many who thought to hide behind stout doors from the madness outside. Limping along in the shadows of the inner hallways, he saw Norns clambering in through the shattered windows of the chapel and stood helplessly by while they caught poor brother Eglaf, who was kneeling in prayer before the altar. Strangyard could no more stay to watch the horror to come than he could do anything to help his fellow man of God. Slipping outside, his eyes full of blinding tears and his heart heavy as lead in his breast, he headed for the inner keep and the prince's rooms. Hiding in the black depths of a hedge, he saw a stout Ethelfrith of Tinset and two of his guardsmen smashed to a red pulp beneath the cudgel of a barking giant. He watched trembling as Lord Constable Edgram bled to death standing upright, swarmed by squeaking diggers. He saw one of the court ladies ripped limb from limb by another of the shaggy Hunan, while another woman crouched on the ground nearby, face blank with madness. All through the shattered freehold, these tragedies were mirrored 1,000-fold, a nightmare seemingly without end. Weeping out a prayer to Osiris, certain that God's face was turned away from Naglemund's death throes, but praying, nevertheless, in desperate, passionate reflex, he staggered around to the front of the inner keep. Two scorched, unhelmeted knights stood there in a tangle of corpses, eyes showing hunted animal white. It was a long moment until he recognized Dearnoth and the prince, and another heart-freezing wait before he could convince them to follow him. It was quieter in the residence's maze of hallways. The Norns had broken in. A few bodies lay crumpled against the walls or splayed out on the stone flags, but most of the people had fled toward the chapel or the dining hall, and the Norns had not stayed to search. That would come later. Izorn unbarred the door at Josua's shouted command. Isgrimner's son, with Einskaldir, and a handful of Irkenlander and Rimmersman's soldiers stood guard over the Lady Vorsheva and the Duchess Gutrin. A few other courtiers were huddled there as well, Towser and the harper Sangfugel among them. While the prince pulled himself coldly from Vorsheva's weeping embrace, Strangyard discovered Yarnauga lying on a pallet in the corner, a blood-soaked bandage twined haphazardly around his head. "The roof of the library fell," the old Rimmersman said, smiling bitterly. "The flames, I fear, have taken nearly all." For Father Strangyard, this was in some way the worst blow of all. He burst out in fresh weeping, tears even trickling down from beneath his eye patch. "Worse. It could be worse, he gulped finally. You might have gone with them, my friend. Yarnauga shook his white head and winced. No, not quite yet. Soon, though. I did save one thing. He pulled from out of his robe the battered parchment of Morganius's manuscript, the top page now ribboned with blood. Carry it safe. It will be of some use still, I hope. Strangyard took it carefully, tying it with a cord from Joshua's table and slipping it into the inner pocket of his cassock. Can you stand? He asked Yarnauga. The old man nodded carefully, and the priest helped him to his feet. Prince Joshua, Strangyard said, holding Yarnauga's elbow, I have thought of something. The prince turned from his urgent conferral with Daernoth and the others to stare impatiently at the archive master. What is it? His eyebrows singed away. Joshua's forehead seemed more prominent than ever, a pale lunar bulge beneath his close-cropped hair. Do you wish me to build a new library? The prince sagged wearily against the wall as the clamor built outside. I'm sorry, Strangyard, that was a foolish thing to say. What has come to your mind? There is a way out. Several of the dirt-streaked, desperate faces turned toward him. What? Joshua asked, bending forward to stare intently. Shall we march out through the gate? I hear it has been opened for us. Strangyard's sense of urgency gave him the strength to stare the prince down. There is a hidden passageway leading out of the guard room to the eastern gate, he said. I should know. You have had me staring at Dendinus' castle plans for months in preparation for the siege. He thought of the rolls of irreplaceable brown parchment covered in the fading ink of Dendinus' careful notes, ashes now, charred in the rubble of the library. He fought down more tears. If we can get there, we may escape up the stile into the Weldhelm Hills. And from there what? Towser asked querulously. Starve in the hills, eaten by wolves in the old hard forest. Would you rather be eaten here and now by less pleasant things? Daernoth snapped. His heart had sped at the priest's words. The faint return of hope was almost too painful, but he would bear anything to get his prince to safety. We will have to fight our way out, Izorn said. Even now I can hear the Norns filling the residence. We have women and some children. Joshua stared around the room at nearly a score of weary, frightened faces. Better to die outside than to be burned alive here, he said at last. He lifted his hand in a gesture of benediction or resignation. Let us go swiftly. One thing, Prince Joshua. Hearing him, the prince came to where the priest was aiding struggling Yarnauga. If we can make our way to the tunnel gate, Strangyard said quietly, we have still another problem to solve. It was built for defense, not escape. It can be as easily opened as closed from the inside. Joshua wiped ash from his brow. You are saying that we must find some way to block it behind us. If we are to have any hope of escape, the prince sighed. A cut on his lip dripped blood onto his chin. Let us reach the gate at all. Then we shall do what must be done. They burst through the door in a pack, surprising a pair of Norns who waited in the corridor. Einskaldir crashed his axe through the helmet of the nearest, throwing sparks in the darkened hallway. Before the other could do more than raise his short sword, he had been skewered between Izorn and one of the Nagleman guardsmen. Daernoth and the prince quickly herded the courtiers out. Much of the din of slaughter had died away. Only an occasional scream of pain or rising chant of triumph floated through the empty hallways. Eye-stinging smoke, licking flames, and the mocking songs of the Norns gave the residents the feel of some terrible underworld, some labyrinth on the edge of the great pit. In the savaged ruins of the castle gardens, they were set on by chittering diggers. One of the soldiers fell dead with a jagged booken knife in his back, and as the rest of the company fought off the others, one of Vorsheva's maidservants was dragged, squealing, down into a gash in the black earth. Daernoth leaped forward to try and save her, impaling a squirming, whistling black body on the end of his sword, but she was gone. Only her delicate slipper, lying in the rain-spattered mud, showed she had even existed. Two of the immense Hunin had discovered the wine cellars and were fighting drunkenly over the last barrel before the inner keep's guardhouse, clubbing and scratching each other in roaring fury. One giant's arm hung limp at his side, and the other had gotten such a terrible wound to his head that a flap of skin hung free, and his face was a sheet of blood. Still they tore at each other, snarling their incomprehensible language in the wreckage of shattered casks and the crushed bodies of Nagleman's defenders. Crouched in the mud at the edge of the gardens, Josua and Strangyard squinted against the driving rain. "The guardroom door is closed," Josua said. "We might be able to get across the open yard, but if it has been bolted from the inside, we are doomed. We would never burst it open in time." Strangyard shivered. "Even if we did, we would not then be able to bolt it behind us." Josua looked at Daernoth, who said nothing. "Still," the prince hissed, "it is what we came for. We shall run." When they had formed up the small company, they set out at a stumbling dash. The two Hunin, one of them with his great teeth fastened in his fellow's throat, were rolling on the ground, locked still in howling battle, like gods of the primordial past. Oblivious to the humans passing by, one of them threw out a massive leg in a paroxysm of pain and knocked the harper Sangfugel sprawling. Izorn and old Towser hurriedly turned back and picked him up. As they did, a shrill, excited shout came from across the courtyard. A dozen Norns, two of them on tall white horses, turned at their fellow's call. Seeing the prince's party, they gave a great cry and spurred forward, galloping past the now senseless giants. Izorn reached the door and pulled. It sprang open, but even as the terrified company began to push inside, the first rider was upon them, a high helm upon his head, a long spear poised in his hand. Dark-bearded Einskaldir dashed forward, with a snarl like a cornered dog, ducking the serpentine strike of the lance, then leaping and throwing himself against the Norn's side. He caught the Norn's flapping cloak in his hand and pushed away, tumbling to the ground and bringing his enemy down after him. The riderless horse skidded on the wet cobbles. Kneeling over the fallen Norn, Einskaldir brought his axe down hard, then crashed it down again. Blind to all around him, he would have been pierced by the spear of the second Norn rider, but Daernoth hefted and threw the lid of a broken barrel, knocking the rider off his horse and into one of the hedges. The howling foot troops were bearing down fast as Daernoth pulled the foaming Einskaldir off the Norn's hacked corpse. They drove through the door moments ahead of the attackers, and Izorn and two of the other pursuers rammed it shut. Spears crashed against the heavy wood. A moment later, one of the Norns called out in a high-pitched, clicking voice. "Axes," Yarnauga said. "I know that much of the Hikidaya tongue. They are going for axes." "Strangyard!" Josua shouted. "Where is the damned passageway?" It's so dark," the priest quavered. Indeed, the room was lit only by the inconstant light of orange flames beginning to burn through the roof beams. Smoke was gathering beneath the low ceiling. I think it is on the south side," he began. Einskaldir and several others sprang to the wall and began pulling down the heavy arrases. "The door!" Einskaldir barked. "Locked," he added a moment later. The keyhole in the heavy wooden door was empty. Josua stared for a moment, even as a sliver of axe blade crashed through the door from the courtyard outside. "Break it down," he said. "You others pile what you can before the other door." In a matter of moments, Einskaldir and Izorn had hacked the bolt right out of the jamb, while Daernoth lifted an unlit torch to the smoldering ceiling. An instant later, the door was knocked off its hinges, and they were through, fleeing up the sloping corridor. Another piece splintered out of the door behind them. "Hang on," We're now at 8 o'clock. Yeah, I think I can finish in about 15 more minutes, so I'm going to continue reading. They ran for several furlongs, the stronger helping the weaker. One of the courtiers at last fell, weeping, to the ground, unable to go farther. Izorn went to pick him up, but his mother, Gutrin, herself staggeringly tired, waved him off. "Leave him lie," she said. "He can keep up." Izorn looked hard at her, then shrugged. As they continued up the slanting stone pathway, they heard the man struggle to his feet, cursing them, and follow. Even as the doors loomed before them, swart and solid in the light of the solitary torch, extending from the floor of the passageway to the roof, the sound of pursuit came echoing up behind them. Fearing the worst, Jazza stretched out his hand to one of the iron rings and pulled. The door swung inward with a soft groan of its hinges. "Osiris be praised," Izorn said. "Get the women and the others through," Jazza ordered, and a moment later 2 of the soldiers had led them well up the passageway, beyond the mighty doors. "Now we come to it," Jazza said. "Either we must find some way to seal this door, or else we must leave enough men behind to slow our pursuers." "I will stay," Einskaldr growled. "I have tasted fairy blood tonight. I would not mind more." He patted his hilt. "No, it is for me and me alone." Yarnauga coughed and sagged on Strangyard's arm, then straightened. The tall priest turned to look at the old man and suddenly understood. "I am dying," Yarnauga said. "I was not meant to leave Naglement. I always knew that. You need only leave me a sword." "You have not the strength," Einskaldr said angrily, as if disappointed. "I have enough to close this door," the old man said gently. "See," he pointed to the great hinges. "They are wrought very fine. Once the door is shut, a blade broken off in the hinge crevice will balk the stoutest pursuer. Go!" The prince turned as if to object. A clicking shout reverberated up the passageway. "Very well," he said. "God bless you, old man." "No need," Yarnauga said. He pulled something shiny from around his neck and pressed it into Strangyard's hand. "Strange to make a friend at the very last," Yarnauga said. The priest's eyes filled with tears, and he kissed the Rimmersman's cheek. "My friend," he whispered, and went through the open door. The last they saw was Yarnauga's bright gaze catch the torchlight as he put his shoulder to the door. It swung closed, damping the sounds of pursuit. The bolts inside slid solidly into place. After climbing a long stairway, they emerged at last into the windy, rain-lashed evening. The storm had thinned, and as they stood on the naked hillside below the wooded stile, they could see fire flickering in the ruins of Nagleman below, and dark, inhuman shapes dancing among the vaulting flames. Jazua stood and stared for a long while, sooty face streaked by the rain. His small party huddled trembling behind him, waiting to take to the path once more. The prince raised his left fist. "Elias!" he shouted, and the wind whipped the echoes away. "You have brought death, and worse, to our father's kingdom. You have raised an ancient evil and shattered the High King's ward. You have unhoused me and destroyed much that I loved." He stopped and fought back tears. "Now you are king no longer. I will take the crown from you. I will take it. I swear." Theernoth caught his elbow and led him away from the pathway's edge. Josua's subjects stood waiting for him, cold and frightened, homeless in the wild Weldhelm. He bowed his head for a moment, in weariness or prayer, and led them into the darkness. All right.
And now our last chapter. Chapter 44, Blood and the Spinning World. The dragon's black blood had spilled over him, burning like a fire. In the instant of its touch, he had felt his own life subdued. The dreadful essence coursed through him, scalding away his spirit and leaving only dragon life. It was as if he himself had become, in the failing moment before darkness, the worm's secret heart. Igjarjuk's smolderingly slow and intricate life captured him. He spread, he changed, and the changing was as painful as both death and birth. His bones became heavy, solid as stone, and curvingly reptilian. His skin hardened into gem-like scales, and he felt his pelt sliding on his back like a mail shirt of diamonds. The dragon's heart blood now moved powerfully in his breast, ponderous as the movement of a dark star in the empty night, strong and hot as the very forge fires of the earth. His claws sank into the world's stony skin, and his age-old heart pulsed and pulsed and pulsed. He grew into the brittle, ancient cleverness of the dragon folk, feeling first the birth of his long-lived race in the earth's infant days, then the weight of uncountable years pressing upon him, dark millennia rushing by like roiling waters. He was one of the eldest of all races, one of the cooling earth's firstborn, and he lay coiled beneath the world's surface as the least of worms might lie hidden in the rind of an apple. The old black blood raced through him. Still he grew, and he perceived and named all things of the spinning world. Its skin, the earth's skin, became his own, the crawling surface on which all living things were born, where they struggled and failed, surrendering at last to become a part of him once more. Its bones were his bones, the rocky pillars on which all things stood, and through which he felt every tremor of breathing life. He was Simon, yet he was the serpent, and he was nevertheless the very earth in its infinitude and detail, and still he grew, and growing felt his mortal life slipping away. In the sudden loneliness of his majesty, fearing that he would lose everything, he reached out to touch those he had known. He could feel their warm lives, sensing them like sparks in a great windy darkness. So many lives, so important, so small. He saw Rachel, bent, old. She sat on a stool in an empty room, holding her gray head in her hands. When had she become so small? A broom lay at her feet, an orderly mound of dust beside it. The castle room was fast darkening. Prince Josua stood on a hillside, looking down. A faint flame-hued light painted his grim face. He could see Josua's doubt and pain. He tried to reach out and give him reassurance, but these lives were only to see, not to touch. A small, brown man he did not know poled his flatboat up a stream. Great trees dangled their branches in the water, and clouds of midges hovered. The little man patted protectively at a sheaf of parchment tucked into his belt. A breeze rattled the trailing branches, and the little man smiled gratefully. A large man. Is Grimner? Where was his beard? Paced on a weather-warped pier and stared out at the darkening sky, at the wind-lashed ocean. A beautiful old man, his long white hair tangled, sat playing with a crowd of half-naked children. His blue eyes were mild, distant, wrinkled in a happy squint. Miriam L., hair close-cropped, looked out from the rail of a ship at the heavy clouds massing on the horizon. The sails snapped and rippled above her head. He wanted to watch her for a longer time, but the vision whirled away like a falling leaf.
A tall Hernestiri woman, dressed in black, kneeled before two cairns of stones in a grove of slender birch trees high on the side of a wind-swept mountain. King Elias stared into the depth of a wine cup, eyes red-rimmed. Sorrow lay across his knees. The gray sword was a wild thing feigning sleep. Morgane suddenly appeared before him, crowned in flame, and the sight drove an icy spear of pain even into his dragon's heart. The old man was holding a great book, and his lips moved in anguished, silent cries as though he shouted a warning. "Beware the false messenger! Beware!" The faces slipped away, but for one last ghost. A boy, thin and awkward, made his way through dark tunnels beneath the earth, crying and crawling through the labyrinth like a trapped insect. Every detail, every twist and turn unwound tortuously before his eyes. The boy stood on a hillside beneath the moon, staring in horror at white-faced figures and a gray sword, but a dark cloud covered the boy in shadow. The same boy, older now, stood before a great white tower. A golden light flashed on his finger, although the boy stood in deep and darkening shadow. Bells were tolling, and the roof had burst into flames. Darkness was engulfing him now, pulling him away toward other, stranger places. But he did not wish to go on to those places. Not until he remembered the name of that child, that gawky boy who labored in ignorance. He would not go on. He would remember. The boy's name was Simon. Simon. And then his sight faded. "Sailman," the voice said, quite loud now. He realized it had been calling him for some time. He opened his eyes. The colors were so intense he quickly shut them, blinded. Spinning wheels of silver and red danced before the darkness of his closed lids. "Come, sailman, come and rejoin your companions. There is need of you here." He unlidded halfway, letting himself grow used to the light. There were now no colors at all. Everything was white. He groaned, trying to move, and felt a terrible weakness, as though some heavy thing pressed down on him all around. At the same time, he felt himself as transparent and fragile as if he were spun from pure glass. Even with closed eyes, he thought he could feel light passing through him, filling him with a radiance that brought no warmth. A shadow crossed his sensitive face, seeming almost to have tangible weight. Something wet and cold touched his lips. He swallowed, felt a bite of pain, coughed, and drank again. It seemed he could taste everywhere the water had ever been. The icy peak, the swollen rain cloud, the stony mountain sluice. He opened his eyes wider. All was indeed overwhelmingly white, except for the golden face of Jiriki, looming nearby. He was in a cave, the walls pale with ash, but for the traces of faint lines. Furs and wooden carvings and decorated bowls were stacked along the edge of the stony floor. Simon's heavy hands, numb yet strangely acute, clutched at the fur coverlet and probed weakly at the wooden cot on which he lay. How? He coughed again. "You are sore. You are tired. That is expected." The Sitha frowned, but his luminous eyes did not change expression. "You have done a very terrible thing, Sailman. Do you know? You have saved my life twice." His head was responding as slowly as his muscles. What exactly had happened? There had been the mountain, the cave, and The dragon, Simon said, choking, and tried to sit up. As the fur robe slid down, he felt the chill of the room in earnest. Light was leaking past a skin hanging at the room's far end. A wave of dizziness left him limp and set his head and face to throbbing. He staggered back. Gone, Jiriki said shortly. Dead or not, I do not know, but gone. When you struck, it tumbled past you and down into the abyss. I could not mark where it fell in the snows and ice of the great deeps. You wielded the sword Thorn like a warrior true, Saoman Snowlock. He took a shaky breath and tried again. Talking made his face hurt. I don't think it was me. Thorn used me. It wanted to be saved, I think. That must sound foolish, but no, I think you may be correct. Look. Jiriki pointed to the cave wall a few feet away. Thorn lay cushioned there on the prince's cloak, black and remote as the bottom of a well. Could such a thing have ever felt alive in his hand? It was easy enough to carry here, Jiriki said. Perhaps this was a direction it wished to go. The Sitha's words set in motion a slow wheel of thought in Simon's mind. The sword wanted to come here? But where is here? And how did we get... Oh, Mother of God, the dragon! Jiriki! He gasped. The others? Where are the others? The prince nodded gently. Ah, yes. I had hoped to wait longer, but I see I have no choice. He closed his wide, bright eyes for a moment. Anai and Grimrick are dead. They have been buried on the mountain Irmsheim. He sighed and made a complicated gesture with his hands. You do not know what it means to bury a mortal and a Sitha together, Saoman. It has been seldom done, and never in 5 centuries. Anai's deeds will live until world's end in the dance of years, the annals of our people, and Grimrick's name will now live with his. They will lie forever beneath the Uden tree. Jiriki closed his eyes and sat for a silent moment. The others, well, they have all survived. Simon felt a clutch at his heart, but pushed away thoughts of the fallen pair for later. He stared at the ash-painted ceiling and saw that the lines were faint scribings of great serpents and long-tusked beasts winding all across the roof and walls. The blank eyes of the creatures troubled him. When he looked too long, they seemed to move. He turned back to the Sitha. Where's Benebik? He asked. I want to speak to him. I had the strangest dream. The strangest dream. Before Jiriki could speak, Haystan poked his head in through the cave mouth. The king does not want to talk, he said, then saw Simon. You're up, lad, he crowed. Oh, that's fine. What king? Simon asked, confused. Not Elias, I hope. No, lad. Haystan shook his head. After what happened up on the mountain, the trolls found us. You were sleeping for some days. We're on Mintahook now, the troll mountain. And Benebik is with his family. Not quite. Haystan looked at Jiriki. The Sitha nodded. Benebik. Sludig, too. Benebik and Sludig, the king's holding them for prisoners. Under sentence of death, some say. What? Prisoners? Simon exploded, then stagged back down as a band of pain tightened cruelly around his head. Why? Sludig, because he is a hated Rimmersman, Jiriki said. Benebik, they say, has committed some terrible crime against the Troll King. We do not yet know what it is, Saoman Snowlock. Simon shook his head in amazement. This is madness. I've gone mad, or I'm still dreaming. He turned accusingly to Jiriki. And why do you keep calling me that name? Don't, Haystan began, but Jiriki ignored him, producing instead from within his jacket the looking glass. Simon sat up and took it, the fine carvings on its frame rough to his sensitive fingers. The wind howled outside the cave, and cold air crept in below the door cloth. Was all the world covered with ice now? Would he never again escape the winter? In other circumstances, he would have been quite taken with the reddish, golden whiskers which were coming in thickly all over his face, but his attention was captured by the long scar running up from his jaw, over his cheek and past his left eye. The surrounding skin was livid and new-looking. He touched it and winced, then slid his fingers up to his scalp. A long swath of his hair had turned as white as the Irmsheim snows. You have been marked, Theoman. Jiriki reached out and touched his cheek with a long finger. For better or for worse, you have been marked. Simon let the mirror drop and covered his face with his hands. And that's the end of the Dragonbone chair, minus the appendices and all that stuff. So with that, when about 20 minutes passed, we have finished this week's reading. And with that comment or that certainty or that knowledge, I will say how much I enjoyed reading the book to you and how much I will enjoy whatever we do together next, and we will do something next very soon. And to thank you all for your patience through the various technical issues and complications and just human stuff and domestic trauma and small crises and things that happen that sometimes delayed or complicated the readings. But as I said, there will be more to come of something Tad and I hope you guys oriented. We'll figure it out as we go. But I will be off next week. So this is the 12th. So the weekend of the 19th, I will certainly be off. Beyond that point, I will let you know. So enjoy your free weekend next weekend. And I will find something to do to entertain myself in your absence. But then I'll be talking to you real soon. So again, thank you all so much. Take very good care of yourselves, your loved ones, your friends and neighbors. I will endeavor to do the same. And we will see each other very soon. So peace and good night.